We turn our attention now to categorical logic, the first of two deductive systems that we're going to study together. Now, we understand already what an argument is. We understand that some arguments are valid, some arguments are invalid. We typically will say that a deductive argument is either valid or invalid, although it's certainly possible to say, and some logicians do say, that any argument that's invalid is then evaluated in terms of strength or weakness. In other words, it's evaluated on inductive criteria. But what we've done is to say that arguments are divided into two types, those that are deductive and those that are inductive. In other words, we say that we generally, let me rephrase that. We reason either effectively mathematically or purely rationally, that is, we reason deductively, and there are certain types of arguments that are classified as deductive and so are evaluated strictly as valid or invalid and sound or unsound. Or we reason empirically or experientially, that is, we reason inductively, and so evaluate an argument as strong or weak and cogent or uncogent. So that's the basic division that we've adopted in our text. So just to review real quick, we're focusing on deductive reasoning, that is, reasoning that follows or attempts to follow a logically correct structure. When a deductive argument is logically correct, it's valid, and if an argument is valid, it's either sound or unsound. In other words, all sound arguments are already valid and the premises are actually true, although some valid arguments aren't sound. We've seen that you can have a valid argument whose premises are not in fact true, and so the argument will not be sound. That's because a sound argument requires not just validity, but also actually true premises. And then we've seen arguments that are deductively classified or evaluated as invalid. So that's the backdrop or background or conceptual framework within which we move into our first division of, our first system of deduction, that is categorical logic. So Aristotle is the discoverer or inventor, depending on which way you want to think about it, of what's known as categorical logic. He is the first thinker to codify a system of logic. It's not that other people weren't logical and weren't using logic, but it wasn't like they had sat down to generate a coherent system of logic so that they would have generated rules of correct reasoning. The other point that I want to make here is related to the last point that I made before we got started about sort of the scope of this system. So you might think about it this way. Aristotle's system of logic was based on classification. How can we determine the relationship between one class of objects and another? Another way to put this is that categorical logic resolves any sentence that's a candidate for an argument into only one of four forms. And so even though there's a lot you can do with this logic, it's actually constructed out of very few elements. What are these four types? We have universal affirmative, universal negative, particular affirmative, and particular negative. Let me give you some examples. Dolphins look like they're smiling is a universal affirmative sentence. None of the directions make sense is a universal negative. Quite a few students are intrigued by logic is a particular affirmative, and lots of dogs are not friendly is a particular negative. And one of the things we're going to want to do is recast each one of these sentence types into what's called a standard form for the categorical proposition. Doing so is going to help us see the logical structure of the given sentence, as well as be able to work with that sentence in terms of what are called immediate inferences or inferences within a categorical syllogism. So let's take a look at the way that we reorganize any sentence that is universal affirmative, universal negative, particular affirmative, particular negative. First is the universal affirmative. Take the example, all stand-up comedians are witty persons. We know that it's a universal because of the quantifier articulated by all, and we know that it's affirmative because there's no negation asserted. Next, we've got two classes of thing or two groups of objects. We've got the subject class or the subject term, and that aligns with the grammatical subject of the sentence. And then we have the predicate term or predicate class, and that is articulated by the grammatical predicate. So we can think about the subject class as taking a predicate, or a subject class as being involved in the predicate class in some way. Notice also that the conjugation of the verb to be, the word are, is what separates out, in terms of our visual as well as our conceptual realms, the subject and predicate classes. We'll notice that this is going to be called the copula. So let's take a look at the four standard forms in terms of the way that the subject and predicate class are related. I'll tell you about the capital letters in just a second. So first, A is the universal affirmative. So let's go back real quick. Remember, all stand-up comedians are witty persons. We took the subject class and the predicate class and replaced those with capital letters S and P. So now we've got all subject class are predicate class. So the capital S and the capital P, in terms of individual propositions, not how they work in an argument, but just in terms of what they are within a single proposition, will be S and P, subject class, predicate class. Notice also that the same is done for the particular affirmative, so universal, all S or P, particular affirmative, some S or P, universal negative, no S or P, and particular negative, some S or not P. So just a reminder now, every single sentence that we deal with is going to resolve into one of these four proposition types expressed in standard form. So the standard form is going to take a quantifier, right? So universal or particular. So the universal quantifier is all for affirmative, no for negative. The quantifier for particular claims are some, and then the particular negative says some not. Now, I've borrowed a screenshot from the text that it gives you I think it's an onomatopoeic way of thinking about this. I don't find this helpful to my learning, but some people do, so I thought, well, why not include it? So you've got A, I, O, and E, and then you can see how that works. Affirmative, A and I, negative, O and E, universal, A and E, particular, I and O. Let's go back to the claim types above that chart. The A proposition is our shorthand, or an A, the capital letter A, is shorthand. I, shorthand. E, shorthand. O, shorthand. For, respectively, universal affirmative, particular affirmative, universal negative, particular negative. So we have A, I, E, and O, or if you want to go universals first, A, E, I, and O. These match up, these letters match up as our shorthand for the relevant claim. Remember, we're just laying out ideas here. We're just putting out our game pieces. We're learning the names. We're learning their functions. So let's take a look at each one now in turn. Universal affirmative, all S are P. That's an A proposition or an A claim. It affirms that every member of the S class is a member of the P class. Another way we're going to think about this is in terms of distribution, which is to say the S class is distributed into the P class. Universal negative asserts that there is not even one member of the S class that is a member of the P class. And by the way, the converse is true. Remember that language, or file it away because it'll come up later. So we'd say that the S and the P classes are mutually exclusive in the universal negative claim. The particular affirmative tells us that there is at least one member of the S class that is a member as well, or also, of the P class. A more articulate way of saying this is that there is at least one member of the S class that is also in the P class. Or we could say there is at least one S that is also a P. Notice the language that I'm using here. In the universal claim, we're talking about every single member of the subject class, either in the affirmative or the negative. Here in the particular, the sum just articulates the existence of at least one. So when we say sum, we're saying there is at least one. We don't know how many, but at least one. Or there exists one thing such that. And then lastly, particular negative, some S are not P. At least one member of S is not a member of P, which is to say that the entirety of the P class excludes from itself at least one S. All right, let's practice. Some political documentaries are shows deserving of acclaim. What we're saying is that there is at least one political documentary, that's the S class, and it is a member of the class of shows deserving of acclaim. The subject is political documentaries. We've already identified that. The predicate class is shows deserving of political acclaim. I want to take a moment just to point out here the following. You may have noticed that both subject and predicate classes in a categorical proposition refer to things. So that means that the subject class and the predicate class in ordinary language are always articulated by nouns or noun phrases. So when you see adjectives, you're going to want to turn the adjective into a noun phrase. We'll talk more about that, but I'm just throwing that out there now so that you can, include that in your thinking. Other technical language that you will be using when you work in this system. So another way to think about the game pieces and how to understand them, or the ingredients and what they are, is quality and quantity and distribution. Now, in my experience, talking about distribution early on tends to just involve knowing that. It's really hard for most of us to grasp the why or what it means of distribution when we haven't yet employed it in actually playing a game or working an inference in categorical logic. So this is partly why I mentioned at the outset that sections A through C involve laying out the basic ideas, the ingredients, the game pieces and their functions before we actually employ them. All right, so what's the quantity of a proposition? It's the how much, universal or particular. The quality is the mode or the what way. In other words, we need to know how much, but we also need to know whether we're affirming or negating our class relationship. So we have all cats are mammals, some cats are mammals, universal and particular. Some cats are mammals is also affirmative. So some cats are mammals is a particular affirmative claim. And then some mammals are not cats is a particular negative claim. So we're going to use quantifiers, and we'll use the quality in terms of how those quantifiers are articulated and whether or not we've got a negation. Then we have the copula, the conjugation of the verb to be, and in the case of the O claim, some S are not P, the negation. Lastly, we say that a categorical class, we say that a class and a categorical proposition is distributed when we know about the entirety of that class, when we have exhausted every member of that class into or precluded every member of that class from participating in another class. Now, most of us grasp distribution fairly clearly for the A, E, I claims, but it's a little harder for O. I'm not sure if that's the case for you, but I want to point that out. If you find that some of this is a little perplexing, there's nothing wrong with you. It's kind of normal. It's like puberty. It sucks, but it's normal and natural. So let's continue. The universal affirmative proposition, the A proposition, all cats are mammals, tells us about the entirety of the cats class. Hence, cats, the subject term, is distributed. Right? So the A proposition distributes cats, or if you want to just eliminate content, the A proposition distributes the subject class. We don't know anything about the relationship of the mammals to the cats class, so we can't go the other direction, but we can certainly say that we know something about the entirety of the cats class. The E proposition distributes both the subject and the predicate classes. That's because the E proposition's classes, the subject and predicate classes, are mutually exclusive. No turtle is a mammal, and no mammal is a turtle. Let's go back up to the A proposition really quickly so you can see the distinction. Every single cat is a mammal, but we can't say, correctly anyway, that every mammal is a cat. That's because the logic of the affirmative universal, that is the A proposition, does not allow us to say that mammals are distributed. Only the S class, in this case the cats class, is distributed. Back down to the E proposition, it is the case that every single turtle is excluded from the mammal class and every single mammal is excluded from the turtle class. Hence, the E proposition distributes both the subject and predicate classes. The I proposition distributes nothing. That's neither good nor bad, it's just the fact of the matter. So don't think that distribution is somehow something that is an evaluative concept for the categorical proposition. It's not. It simply is a descriptive way of talking about these propositions. Why are the I propositions classes undistributed? Because we only know that there is at least one S that's a P, and conversely, at least one P that's an S, but we don't know about the entirety of either class. The O proposition, on the other hand, tells us that the entirety of the fuel-efficient vehicles class excludes from itself at least one thing, namely cars. So notice that the predicate class is distributed. The subject class is not. Here's some a shorthand that you might want to have handy as you're working through inferences, not just in chapter 5, but also later on in chapter 6. I find that having this handy, typically these distribution shorthands handy help us understand what's distributed and what's not in terms of individual claims A, E, I, and O. So the superscript D tells us that the subject is distributed in the universal affirmative and the universal negative. The U in the the superscript U tells us that in the universal affirmative and the particular affirmative, that the predicate class is undistributed. So wherever you see a superscript D, wherever you see a superscript U, you should understand respectively distributed and undistributed. So remember, the A proposition distributes the subject class only. That's all SRP. The E proposition, the E claim, distributes both the subject and predicate classes. That's no SRP. The I claim, some SRP, distributes neither the subject nor the predicate class. And finally, the O proposition, the some S are not P proposition, distributes only the predicate class. And then the other shorthand on the right hand side of the screen gives you another way of thinking about distribution. Okay, let's go ahead and work on our understanding. Some protein supplements are not healthy diet aids. Is this a universal affirmative, a universal negative, a particular affirmative, or a particular negative? Next, what is the subject class? What is the predicate class? What's distributed? Is the subject class distributed? Is the predicate class distributed? Both or neither? What's the quantity? What's the quality? Is it a universal or a particular? Is it affirmative or negative? Go ahead and think about it, or pause while you think about it, and then let's check our understanding's answer. We've got particular negative. The subject is undistributed. The predicate term is distributed. What is the particular negative? Remember, that's the O class. The last concept that we're going to look at in terms of the laying out of our basic elements of categorical logic is existential import. Here again, similarly to distribution, existential import doesn't always make sense to everybody when we just lay out the idea. Instead, working it typically helps people to understand what it means. But let me at least give you the basic idea and try to make some sense of it, so that as you're working, you can say, oh, okay, I may not have the most robust understanding, but at least I know how this thing works, and I think I understand what it means to assume or not assume existential import. So there are two ways that we're going to think about universal claims. Remember, a universal claim is an A proposition or an E proposition. In other words, a universal proposition is either affirmative or negative, all SRP or all SRP or no SRP. The question that we're being asked here is whether or not we assume a member of the subject class exists. Now, Aristotle says yes, and there are good philosophical reasons why. What's known as the modern interpretation of categorical claims does not assume existential import, and there are also good reasons why. So what we want to be able to do is think in terms of whether or not we assume a member of the subject class exists in a universal affirmative or a universal negative. One of the reasons why I think it's worth thinking in terms of assuming or not assuming existential import is because it helps us to just pause and think about what we're saying when we make categorical claims. So take a look at the examples. All cats are mammals, all unicorns are mammals. If we assert with Aristotle that a member of the subject class exists, we are going to say that the first claim, all cats are mammals, is true. And we would say that the second claim is false, since, in fact, there are no unicorns. But what if instead we say, I am going to treat the subject class of the universal claim the same? In other words, I don't care whether or not cats actually exist. I don't care whether or not unicorns actually exist, because what I'm really after is just the structure of the claim itself, not what the structure of that claim may or may not imply in terms of its corresponding particular. So think about it this way. If we assume that there is a member of the unicorn class in the first claim, all unicorns are mammals, then it would follow that the claim some unicorns are animals is true. This is an inference known as subalternation. We'll talk about that later. But you can see the problem, right? If we claim that a universal affirmative is true and we assume that there is a member of the subject class, we're committing ourselves to the truth of the particular affirmative claim, the corresponding particular. So what we want to think about is what the implications are of assuming existential import. Okay, so just as a quick reminder, we will assume existential import when we're working in what's known as the Aristotelian or traditional interpretation of the universal claim. We will not assume existential import when we're working in the version of the system known as the modern, that involves, the modern interpretation of the universal claim. I hope this introduction to categorical logic's basic features has been helpful. We're now in a position to build on it by looking at how we make immediate inferences. That is, how we make an inference from one categorical proposition to another, what the requirements are for a valid inference, and what types of valid inference we can make. Once we're done with that work, we'll move into a study of the categorical syllogism, which is another type of inference, that is, an inference from two premises to a conclusion using only categorical propositions.